global warming and climate change, and NASA recently revealed that the world's sea level has risen by nearly 8 centimetres since 1992, and the UN has estimated that the world's sea levels will rise by a metre or more by the end of the century. Of course, that has huge effects everywhere. In some parts of the world, it means hurricanes and cyclones and storms and greater ferocity than ever witnessed before. And when I was in Cuba recently, government ministers spoke of their concern arising from climate change, particularly in that island, the problem of drought. Now, if we come back to our own island, the EU Commission's Energy and Climate Package of 2008, we are required to deliver a 20% reduction in non-emissions trading scheme, ETS, greenhouse gas emissions by 2020, relative to the levels that existed 10 years ago. And this isn't a very ambitious target, but it's crucially important. It seems that we're not going to meet our 20% reduction target by 2020, and we'll actually be lucky to achieve half of this. And strong growth in emissions from transport, agriculture, and so on are key factors in this. But non-compliance with achieving the reduction targets, as you know, Taoiseach, carries with it fines of €600 million in 2021. That should be a secondary consideration. But are you concerned that we will not reach our target reduction? And what steps have been taken to reverse this trend? On the issue of the UN forces, as you'll know better than me, 500 Defence Forces personnel are committed to 12 different international missions, with the UN Interim Force in Lebanon, with the UN Disengagement Observer Force in Syria. And we also have famously the 60 naval personnel on the LE Samuel Beckett, saving thousands of lives in the Mediterranean. And all of these men and women are performing their duties with distinction, and they deserve our support and commendation. So, has there been any additional requests from the UN for Irish troops or other personnel to serve in other trouble spots? And I've raised this issue with you a few times. Has the government resolved to the satisfaction of our naval personnel engaged in the maritime humanitarian search and rescue operation in the Mediterranean the amount paid to them for this stressful and hazardous work that they're engaged in? And the Minister for Defence said a month ago that the naval service personnel are not involved in an armed mission. But the fact is that they have to be armed, because some of the people they're dealing with are dangerous people, smugglers, and I'm sure our hearts go out to those refugees, but also to the naval personnel having to retrieve the drowned remains of women and men and children from the sea. So they certainly deserve to be financially recognised for their efforts, and we were told that the issue of payments was under review. So can you give us a progress report on this? On the issue of refugees, and we're a nation which have our own memories of folk memories and historical memories of coffin ships. And we now watch this on our television screens as people make this huge trek, hundreds of kilometres across the European mainland. And every week brings a different element of this. So, did you have the opportunity to talk to the UN Secretary-General about any of the detail about Ireland's contribution to resolving, or at least trying to relieve, this problem? Will our own refugee protection scheme, will we actually accept the 4,000 refugees that are currently planned for? How quickly can that proceed? I thought the number, I can't remember off the top of my head now, that we're going to take between now and Christmas was pitiably small. So maybe you would have other information on the progress of the programme, the numbers anticipated to arrive and when they will arrive, and the provision of accommodation and services for refugees. And given the way we treat people in the DRAC provision centres, and given the way we treat the travelling community, we would need to be sure that we aren't creating more difficulties for these folks when they reach our shores. Did you have the opportunity, Taoiseach, to discuss the Palestinian situation? I've raised this with you most recently. When I raised it last week, you didn't answer me. You told me you would get back to me. I then received a letter from the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and it's totally unsatisfactory. It fudges the entire issue. It fails to move or to acknowledge the expressed support of the Oireachtas for a Palestinian state. It's all about ongoing discussions and ongoing assessments and so on and so forth. But what we need to do is show leadership. And in these issues, I've said to you many times here, Ireland actually has a certain global reputation, just given our own colonial past, and also given the success of our own peace process, imperfect though that may be. So when we speak in these issues, we speak not least to the people in that region in a way that they would understand and would respect. So what do you do if you're a Palestinian kid, being treated the way they've been treated at this time? If there's nobody from outside the circle standing up for you, if there's nobody saying you do have rights, and we recognise those rights. And the EU Foreign Affairs Council meets next Monday. Here's an opportunity. I never get a report back on all the meetings that you attend. I never get a report back on this dreadful situation. And of course, that is the unresolved Israeli-Palestinian issue, is at the main core of the destabilisation of that entire region. And then finally, Concordia, on the issue of the rights and entitlements of the LGBT citizen, and the yes vote was a huge victory for humanity when overwhelmingly people voted for marriage equality, and the fact that it's been brought into law so quickly is also to be commended. And you'll know that the Assembly in Belfast narrowly voted in support of marriage equality just recently. Sinn Féin have moved that motion. I think that was the 6th time, this time with the support of the SDLP. Previously, the other 5 times we did it on our own. But the DUP and the other unionists blocked it from becoming law. But it was still, I think, a very, very important vote of confidence and a very, very clear signal to LGBT citizens. There are, as you have noted, an awful lot of states, I think 80 states within the UN, who have criminal laws against sexual activity by lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender citizens. And in at least 8 of these, the death penalty can be imposed. And Russia, while they do not have laws against homosexual acts, they do have repressive laws against what they describe as the propaganda of homosexuality. And there has been, again, as you noted, some successes recently in overturning some of these laws in some states. Did the Secretary-General give any indication of the work of the UN in combating these injustices?
Thank you. Taoiseach.
Let me just say, in respect of the Palestinian issue that you've raised, clearly we referred to this on a number of occasions last week. At my request, Deputy Adams was written to by Minister Flanagan. The Government recognises fully the interests of members of the House on this issue and the interest of the members here at Concordia on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and have done so for many years. Now, let me say that our goal is achieving statehood for Palestine in reality and not rhetorically. Minister Flanagan, on behalf of the Government and therefore the people, is continuing to reflect on whether early recognition by Ireland would be a positive contribution to the situation and how it might affect our voice and influence on the issue. Is it the right thing to do? Is now the right time? What are the consequences of it? And at this moment, with the current wave of violence in Israel and in Palestine, our immediate priority, quite rightly I think, has to be directed towards reducing tensions and general de-escalation of that volatile situation there. So Minister Flanagan and his counterparts across the EU will discuss, as part of the agenda, Deputy Adams, the Middle East peace process at the Foreign Affairs Council on the 16th of November. The situation insofar as climate change is actually more severe than you mentioned, because whoever is in government between 2020 and 2030, if the targets are set for 2030 based on the 2020 targets, the fines could run to the order of 5 or 6 billion, which is an astronomical charge. And that means that there's a real challenge here for this government at the moment, and obviously the people will elect a new government in the spring. And if that becomes my responsibility, we've got a real challenge between here and 2020 at Concordia, because our profile is similar to only one other country, and that's New Zealand in terms of the agri-sector. So I've always held the view that the analysis that was done originally, that perhaps the scientific analysis wasn't as strong as it might be, and it makes it difficult, very difficult for this country to achieve 2020 targets, never mind 2030 targets. And that means that if you were to get any give from Europe, or from any country in Europe, somebody else has got to take up that slack. So the cost of reducing carbon for us is we have less room for manoeuvre than others because of our particular circumstances. And that's, believe me, that's an issue that I've referred to with President Hollande the last time I was over there in Paris, and saying that we would attend and support COP21, which he will hold in December next month in Paris. So it's actually very severe, Deputy Adams, in terms of the potential, charge on the country here. And we've got some of the best minds dealing with this sector at Concordia, trying to work out how technically and politically we might be able to demonstrate that we want to achieve targets that we can achieve, but that we shouldn't be saddled with something that is unachievable. Now, most of Ireland's climate financing to developing countries, to answer your question, it comes to 34 million a year. That's been provided through the Irish Aid Programme. Those resources are delivered principally for climate change adaptation in sub-Saharan African countries through our country programmes, civil society organisations and international organisations and so on. In respect of the climate change thing in general, we have our national policy position. This government has pursued the transition to a low-carbon agenda. Our goal is to achieve a competitive, low-carbon, climate-resilient and environmentally sustainable economy by 2050. The government's Climate Action and Low-Carbon Development Bill, which is currently before the Seanad, will build on existing efforts to decarbonise the economy. The bill sets out the process to achieve this transition, including the adaptation of a series of national mitigation plans. In anticipation of enactment of the legislation, work has already begun on the first such plan. A cross-departmental steering group will ensure that the whole-of-government approach to the plan and engagement across the sectors that is necessary will actually happen. And the Climate Action and Low-Carbon Development Bill also places the government's adaptation efforts on a legal and statutory footing. These efforts are focused on the National Climate Adaptation Framework, published back in 2012. And to protect vulnerable communities, the government has prioritised the introduction of a new flood risk management programme being handled by Minister of State Harris. By 2021, spending on this programme will be of the order of €100 million per year at Concordia. The Climate Bill also provides for an independent advisory council to advise government on matters relevant to both mitigation and adaptation. The Climate Change Advisory Council was announced in June of this year and is due to have its second meeting at the end of November, so as to input into the important preparatory work already underway. Now, in respect of the conference in Paris, we will strongly support an ambitious, legally binding global agreement with broad participation as a core outcome of COP21 in Paris. And as a member of the EU, we are committed as a country to playing our part in reaching an historic agreement here. The agreement and supporting decisions should put the world on a collective pathway to limit the average global temperature increase to less than 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Ireland also recognises that some of the poorest and most vulnerable countries need real assistance, both in responding to and adjusting to climate change. And despite our recent economic circumstances, we've maintained a flow of climate-related aid, delivering approximately 34 million in grants every year, mainly to those countries in sub-Saharan Africa. We are actively exploring options for scaling up that mobilisation of climate finance from both public and private sources. And the recent passage is one example of the bill going through of the steps that we take here. Deputy Adams mentioned about the defence personnel. I don't think, Deputy, we've had any further requests from the United Nations for defence personnel. They have to come before the Cabinet anyway, and before the Oireachtas here, before they can be approved in the context of the conditions that are set out for participation by Irish troops. But I'll advise Deputy Adams on that. In regard to the migration crisis and the asylum seekers, we're not part of the protocol, as you know, Cancora, but we decided to opt into the protocol and said we would agree to accept approximately 4,000 asylum seekers and refugees under the resettlement and relocation programmes over a couple of years. And this is well in excess of any sort of notional quota that might be allocated. It includes 520 refugees which we have offered to resettle from existing refugee camps. Some of these have now started to arrive here in Ireland. It also includes 2,800 under the Commission's relocation proposals and an initial tranche of 20 asylum seekers from Italy or Greece will arrive here before Christmas, and in stages afterwards the other numbers will arrive. And this first tranche will include Syrian and Eritrean asylum seekers. The remaining approximately 680 people of that group will be taken on resettlement or relocation, with the final breakdown yet to be decided. As you know, we've deployed the naval vessel in the Mediterranean since June, first the Ethna, then the Niamh, and now the Samuel Beckett. 8,066 individuals have been rescued by the 4th of November, Cancora, which speaks for itself. Obviously, this rotation is due to be completed at the end of November. And at that stage, obviously it's winter time, there may not be the number of boats travelling the Mediterranean, and the question of a further deployment at that stage will be considered in the context of what's actually happening there. In regard to the PD4 issue that you raised, Deputy, I don't want to comment on something that's the subject of arbitration at the moment, but suffice it is to say that it hasn't been lost sight of, put it that way. Now, also, Cancora, finally, we do provide financial support to other areas affected by instability and conflict. 41 million has been provided by the end of 2015 towards assisting those displaced as a result of the Syrian crisis. This is Irish Aid's largest response to a single crisis in recent years. 36 million has gone into Somalia in humanitarian issues since 2008. And furthermore, we committed and approved a doubling of our World Food Programme from 10 million to 20 million euro per annum for the next 3 years. High Representative Mogherini pointed out at a recent council meeting that the level of food being given out for the meals under the World Food Programme had been halved, which was causing difficulty for thousands of children in particular suffering from malnutrition and lack of quality food. Now, at the Valletta summit, which takes place I think next week, Minister Fitzgerald will also make a formal announcement of a significant contribution to the European Union Trust Fund for Africa. The establishment of the Irish Refugee Protection Programme and particularly the efforts of the Interdepartmental Task Force are important elements that we have to consider as well.
Short supplementary.
Very briefly, Taoiseach, in your meeting with Ban Ki-moon,
Accord Sinn Féin didn't go solo. This is an Oireachtas motion. The entire Oireachtas agreed to this motion, and the key issue is that the government has failed to act on the determination of the Oireachtas. And when I was speaking a moment ago, I said to the Taoiseach that the letter that I got from the Department of Foreign Affairs at his request was entirely unsatisfactory. So then what did the Taoiseach do? In his reply, he read out the content, essentially, That was in the letter. So what we want to see is the government recognising the state of Palestine. We recognise the state of Israel, quite rightly. I support that position. I believe in a two-state settlement. So why recognise one state and not recognise the other state? And the notion that you have to wait until there's a settlement, there will not be a settlement unless progressive states like this, in the international sense, raise our voice. Who else is going to do it?
Thank you.
Who else?
Taoiseach.
I did see the Palestinian flag flying at the United Nations on the day of the discussions on climate change, and obviously that was remarked upon by quite a number of people. The only point I'm making, Debbie Adams, is if you follow through with it now, given the fragility and the uncertainty that's going on there arising from the violence in Jerusalem and so on. Let me consider this. I'll certainly be happy, Deputy, to have the Minister for Foreign Affairs and Minister Sherlock sit down with the opposition spokespersons on foreign affairs, have a look at this. I was actually invited to go to both Israel and Palestine when I met with the Israeli people in the UN, because they were sitting across the aisle from Ireland and alphabetical order and an issue like that, and I raised it in conversation with them. The flood relief is set out, Deputy Martin, as best we can over the period ahead. Clearly there are problems in your own city, in Cork and in Galway, a number of other places around the country that have been very severely damaged both by storms in the Atlantic and the Irish Sea, and other places that are flooded because of rising tides and exceptional levels of water in the rivers and lakes. We have a mid-term review of the capital programme, which sets out over 20 billion between here and 2021. So the programme is being driven by Minister Harris, and obviously some of these works are pretty major. They take a while to put in place with planning and foundations and the scale and engineering works and all the rest of it. You'd like to think you'd have more, but between here and 2021 there'll be quite a substantial amount of money actually spent at Cancora, reaching 100 million by 2021. But we could look at that question as part of the mid-term review of the capital programme. There may be, pieces of infrastructure that may not be able to go ahead at Cancora because of court decisions or planning objections or whatever. And if the economy continues to improve, which I hope it will, and you arrive at a balanced budgetary position from 2019, 2020, 2021, will be more available for whatever government the people elect in order to be able to deal with many of the challenges, social and infrastructural, that we have. So we could look at it in the context of a mid-term review, I would think.
Question 14.
Partnership. Minister of State for European Affairs and Data Protection, Dara Murphy, TD, attended the less formal discussion session on the 11th of June on my behalf. In my own intervention, I supported closer ties between the EU and CELAC and raised the key global challenges of development and climate change, our priorities with regard to human rights, disarmament and conflict resolution, and the importance of 2015 for global cooperation. I noted the historic opportunity that this year provides for global consensus on many of the key challenges that we face, particularly the UN post-2015 development agenda, where Ireland was one of the UN co-facilitators for the final negotiations and efforts to tackle climate change. The main outcome documents of the summit were the political declaration titled "A Partnership for the Next Generation" and an action plan, which I will circulate with this reply. The focus of the action plan is on areas including science, research, innovation and technology, sustainable development, environment, climate change, energy, regional integration and education to promote social inclusion and cohesion. On the margins of the summit, I had 3 bilateral meetings with the presidents of Chile, Colombia and Mexico. In my meeting with President Bachelet Gerria of Chile, I expressed my congratulations on the programme called Startup Chile and my appreciation that Irish entrepreneurs have had the opportunity to participate in that programme. I also extended an invitation to the President to visit Ireland. During my conversation with President Juan Manuel Santos of Colombia, I noted Ireland's support for the peace process in Colombia, the efforts of the Colombian government to promote human rights, and Ireland's recent ratification of the EU-Colombia EU-Colombia-Peru Free Trade Agreement, as well as the interest in growing our relations with Colombia. I also noted that the Vice Minister for Foreign Affairs of Colombia, Ms. Patty Londono, was due to visit Ireland on the 17th and 18th of June this year. She subsequently did so and met with the Minister for Foreign Affairs and Trade, Minister Flanagan. I would like to take this opportunity to warmly welcome the appointment of former Taoiseach Eamon Gilmore to the role of EU Special Envoy for together the restoration of diplomatic relations with Cuba, and this holds the potential for serious economic development and opportunity for the people in Cuba and for so many other countries as well. I think we're out of time, we can't call, so maybe I'll leave it at that.
Thank you.